Good afternoon and welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists November webinar. My name is Kim Ponzio and I'm a past president of SWS and the current chair of the SWS webinar committee. And I'm going to be your moderator today. The general format for today's webinar will be a 45-minute presentation by our speaker, which will be followed by about 15 minutes for questions and announcements after that. So before we get started, sorry about that. There we go. Before we get started, let me take a moment to familiarize you with the GoToWebinar system. On the right side of your screen, you will have a control panel that looks like the example on this slide. And in the audio pane, you can adjust the webinar audio by using your telephone or your computer speakers. And at any time during the presentation, you can type your questions into the questions pane. Our presenter will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. And if you'd like a copy of today's slides, please find that PDF copy in the handouts pane at the bottom of the control panel. And as a reminder, webinar certificates worth 1 hour of participation are available upon request and can be used to apply or renew your professional wetland scientist or your wetland professional and training certification. So please contact SWS staff if you're interested in the certificate. You can also get a certificate if you watch the webinar recordings. All webinars are recorded and we archive those for complimentary viewing by the members on our past webinars page. And in fact, this presentation will be recorded and you'll receive a link to that recording following the webinar. We also ask that you take a moment to complete the evaluation survey that's going to pop up at the end of the webinar. In addition, we encourage you, if you're so inclined, to use the hashtag SWS webinar on Twitter to tweet about today's webinar. So let's test the questions pane, and at the same time, we'll get some demographic information on those that are participating. So if you could just type in the state or country that you're participating from, and the number of people that happen to be in the room with you in the questions pane. So I see some people from Texas and Florida, the UK, Colorado, Maine, Denver, Missouri, some more in Florida, Alaska, let's see, Mexico. So we have people inside the United States and in other countries, North Carolina. And so it's really good to kind of see that we've got a good turnout for today's webinar, and with the logistics out of the way, I'm going to get started with the webinar. So it's my pleasure to welcome today's presenter, Andy Herb. Andy Herb is the owner of Alpine Eco, which was founded in 2007. He's worked as a professional ecologist over 19 years, and although most of his work has been in the Western United States, he has also successfully completed projects in the Republic of Korea, Japan, and Guam. His work involves most aspects of field ecology with a focus on wetland and vegetation studies. He's been involved in many projects that included Clean Water Act, National EP, Environmental Policy Act, and Endangered Species Act compliance, as well as general natural resource management. Andy has led both research-oriented and infrastructure-related work for nearly all types of clients in the private and public sectors, including dozens of projects involving wetland creation and restoration. He is the immediate past president of the Rocky Mountain chapter of the Society of Wetland Scientists, and he's also the founder and chairperson of the SWS's very successful wetland restoration section. His commitment to science and the environment, combined with his practical approach to problem solving, results in creative, cost-effective, and ecosystem-friendly approaches to projects. Andy is also the owner of Alpine Eco Nursery, founded in 2012, which provides native wetland and riparian plants for ecological restoration in the Rocky Mountain region. So welcome, Andy, and I'll turn things over to you for the presentation today.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kim. Thanks, everybody, for attending. And as Kim mentioned, my work with SWS has really been focused on trying to integrate science and practice, especially with regard to wetland restoration. So, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm defining restoration in its broadest sense, and including wetland reclamation, wetland rehabilitation, compensatory mitigation for regulatory purposes, in the US at least, for Clean Water Act compliance. Basically anything that we're doing to provide some ecological lift to wetland or riparian habitats, I'm sort of dumping into the wetland restoration category. So you'll be hearing me interchange the terms mitigation and restoration in the presentation, and just wanted to make sure we're all clear on that. And one thing that I've learned about this kind of work is that there are a lot of different ways to get similar results. And so my presentation today, if I was going to amend the title, I would add tips for practitioners, because this presentation is really about giving you a brief summary of some of the projects I'm working on, and then talking about restoration tips. There's lots of good research being done out there, but most of the work that I've done, most of the techniques that I've been using for restoring wetlands started with research and started with all the literature that I could find early in my career, and then it's evolved to mostly lessons learned and trial and error and failures informing my decision making. So most of the presentation, again, like I said, we'll start with some project overviews, and then most of the presentation will just be about these tips on restoration planning and design, implementing restoration plans, monitoring your restoration sites, and then we'll finish real briefly with some ideas that I have for how we might improve restoration generally. So let's get started. I've got 4 projects I wanted to share with you, and they're spread around the state. We have 3 different regions, basically, of Colorado. The eastern half is essentially part of the Great Plains. The middle third of the state is essentially all higher elevation, western mountains and valleys. And then the western third is arid west. We're going to start with a project outside of Meeker, which is in the western mountains and valleys. This is a river restoration project where we restored about 3 miles of channel and 3 acres of wetlands on the floodplain. And I did this project with another company that did most of the in-channel work. I don't really do much work in streams. I do everything outside of the streams. And so this is what the site looked like before construction, before our project. Very straight. There wasn't a lot of overbank flooding happening because of some work that had been done in this area in the 80s and previously. And so there were also some areas where there were lots of these rock weirs that were put in the 80s. And so the channel had kind of started to degrade and turn into this multi-thread system, which ate up some of the wetlands on the floodplain. And so we wanted to come in, return this to a single thread system, and restore some of the wetlands on the floodplain. So we basically filled some of these channels, and let's see. Sorry, having a slide advancement problem here. There we go. So the channels, the old channels here in green. Oh, sorry, they caught up with me. Hold on. Okay, so the restoration areas are in green here. So that's basically part of the channels that we filled. And then you can see 2 years later, this is our project. And the red circles are really just for your reference so that you can calibrate your eye on the aerial. And so again, restored this to a single thread system. There's our restoration sites showing up in the green circles. We have very nice, very quick response to our project. Here's another reach that we worked on. You can see all those weirs in the channel. We basically pulled those out, restored some sinuosity, and re-wetted the floodplain. So again, very nice results 2 years later. This is what the sites look like on the ground. You can see great vegetation establishment. These are 2 different sites 1 year after construction. So we were able to salvage a lot of sod and a lot of whole willow transplants. Okay, so that's it for the Meeker project. Now let's move to one in Fort Collins. This is the home of Colorado State University, where many of my friends and colleagues do their work. This is on Fossil Creek, right in town. We restored 1,500 feet of the channel and about an acre of wetlands, and did this project with Ayers Associates. And here you can see it's pretty confined work area. We have residential development and ball fields on both sides, and this was a drainage that was historically probably not even perennial, and became a water conveyance system, basically carrying water from one canal to the next, which completely unraveled this whole thing. Our design, this is our design. The different colors represent different target habitat types. So red being emergent wetland, green being scrub shrub, and blue being riparian, and then yellow uplands. And so this is what it looked like after construction. So 2015, we did the work. As I said, it's very confined. So we had to use these soil lifts in some areas to protect the banks because we couldn't lay them back and get shallower slopes. But you can see excellent vegetation establishment in 1 year. Again, the red circles to calibrate your eye. A lot of these are really hard to convince yourself you're looking at the same view, especially for this project. Incidentally, the site was, the housing development was under construction in 2013, so all the houses aren't even in this photo. That's why it looks a little different. Again, here's another view. You can see in the lower left, this is really nice. Right after construction, you can see our zonation that we were planning on. You can see the zone of saturation. So again, very nice establishment 1 year later. Okay, another example project is one in Crested Butte. This is again in the higher elevations, and this was the Slate River restoration. We also call this one the Peanut Reach because it's on next to Peanut Lake. And here's our excavator in the foreground for scale, so you can see what this site looks like. Basically, this is the town of Crested Butte, and our site is just outside of town, right next to Peanut Lake, which is a very popular recreation destination for bird watching and hiking. And our project, you can see Slate River here is very close to Peanut Lake, and the river is actually threatening to capture the lake. This reach of the river had been degraded by some gravel mining activity. There's an old berm here along the channel that prevents some of this overbank flow away from the lake. And so there's a lot of pressure on the lake right here. So our plan worked with my friend and colleague Mark Beardsley at Ecometrics. The existing channel here is in green, and our proposal was to move the channel to the blue. So as part of that, we would take the berm out, use the material from the berm to fill the old channel, and then also use material from our new channel construction to fill the old channel. This is what it looked like on the ground, excavating the new channel. And here, this is right after we were able to turn the water into the new channel. So the water is coming from the top to the bottom in the new channel here, and you can see we're pushing our material into the old channel to provide that buffer between the lake to the left and the new channel to the right. And here you can really see how we were able to salvage the sod and whole willows here to form our river right bank. So that worked out nicely. This is a shot of the site this spring, and you can see we're looking for a nice emergent wetland establishment here and some scrub shrub environment here. This was, peak flow for this year. The water's quite high. Okay, next project and last one is over in the arid west in Delta, Colorado. This was a 404 compliance project, a Clean Water Act compliance project. So wetland mitigation, created about 3 acres of wetlands down at the confluence of the Uncompahgre River here, the dirty, muddy one, and the Gunnison River. This was a map of the site before our project. So existing wetlands are in green, and these red areas are berms, old fill areas that we wanted to remove from the floodplain, again, to try to reconnect these rivers to the floodplain environment. This is the plan, basically to create new wetlands here in orange and connect to the old, take these berms out, and create what is essentially a meander scar or secondary channel type environment. Originally, I wanted to connect this to the Gunnison River on the downstream end here, but because of land ownership issues, we couldn't actually do that. So we ended up making our backwater connection here on the side, and that allows high flows to enter the site and provide additional functions that we wouldn't get if we didn't have that surface connection. We didn't want to connect here at the top because we didn't want to run the risk of capturing the river in our site. Here's the construction of the connection to the river, and then the other side photos here are pulling the berms out, mostly broken concrete from, I think, from the 40s and 50s. This is what the site looked like after construction. Again, just a meander scar type setting. We were able to salvage some of the trees we had to take down, which we only had to take down about a half a dozen, but we were able to salvage them and place them back into the wetland area as habitat features. So you can see here, this is right after construction in 2013. The site's very dry and cobbly. Maybe would make some people nervous, but I felt confident in our design and our depth of excavation, knowing that we would be getting seasonal inputs from the river and seasonally high groundwater. So just kind of crossed our fingers and hoped for a normal snowpack, because that's what's feeding this system is snowmelt in the higher mountains nearby. And luckily, it worked out. This was spring 2014, and we had really good snowpacks. We had excellent runoff. You can see this is the Gunnison River flowing left to right and entering our site as planned through our backwater channel. And then we were actually getting some additional input here from the top because the river was so high. Our normal high flows would be only entering here. So it worked out great having that water enter the site, and then it actually stayed in the site for about 6 weeks. We ended up getting all kinds of fines deposited, and it created a perfect environment for the germination of thousands of cottonwoods and willows, creating this blanket. And you can see in this photo, we actually have some of our existing, our planted willows in the photo too. So it turned out great. This is the site this year, 2017. We've got willows, 8 feet tall, and cottonwoods as well. Another good kind of success story for us on the Gunnison River floodplain. Okay, so that's about all I've got for project overview. I wanted to go ahead and get into some of the restoration tips. And again, I didn't mention this on the outline slide, but this presentation is not intended to be a comprehensive list of things that you need to know to restore wetlands. It's not even a complete list of the different steps that need to be taken. What it is basically some of the issues that seem to come up frequently, topics that are easy to discuss in this kind of format, and important things that I think could provide some value to you as practitioners or researchers on your projects, hopefully. So I want to start by talking a little bit about planning and design tips and the importance of pre-project assessment. We need to have some data to guide our restoration designs and our restoration goals. And the best way to do that is to do the pre-project assessment so you know what's wrong with your site. So again, let's go back to our Meeker example. In this case, I'm using a tool, functional assessment of Colorado wetlands. This is BackWet, we call it, designed or created by my friend and colleague, Dr. Brad Johnson, and also Mark Beardsley and Jessica Duran. It's a rapid assessment method for assessing wetland condition. It basically gauges the departure from reference condition. So, 10-page data form, you end up scoring different variables, and you can see for this project, our hydrology variables got dinged pretty hard because of those weirs and levees and lack of overbank flow. And then we can take those variable scores and turn them in to function scores, and that again helps guide us, like what is it we're trying to fix? What are the goals for our project? So we're using this assessment tool to tell us what we really want out of our project. Another way to get information about your project and what you want your restoration goals to be is to use reference sites. This one is a little problematic in my opinion. It's hard, to know what reference condition is. It's hard to define what reference is and what it means. And it's sometimes hard to find reference sites honestly. In some of these areas where there's been significant human development, it's difficult. So I wanted to just touch on this briefly with a project. This is on the Poudre River. It flows basically from outside of Fort Collins, Colorado, down to Greeley, Colorado. This summer, I did an assessment of the riparian vegetation of 40 miles of the Poudre River, and this site struck me as kind of a potential reference site for the project. Connected floodplain, meaning it's overbank flooding into this area. You can't see the river in this photo, but it's just off to the left. So we're getting, the site's getting wet seasonally, which is allowing for a lot of cottonwood and other woody plant recruitment through this kind of regular disturbance regime of, big flow events and then low flow. And the site really looked good. It was really what we wanted to see adjacent to the river. And so we scored all these different riparian polygons, and our photo was taking right around here where my cursor is. But you can see we scored these sites anywhere from an A+ to a solid Bs and C+, which is pretty good. But it might strike you as fairly low scores for a quote-unquote reference site. But I just wanted to make the point that these reference sites aren't always pristine. They have to be within the realm of what's possible today, given our constraints. And what's interesting is if we zoom out a little bit more, this is the same area, and you can see the scores around here are pretty bad. Like we have some Ds and some Fs, basically because of land use practices and so on. And if we zoom out even more, we can see, wow, this reach of the river is really altered. How could you possibly get a reference site in this reach? But if we look for a diamond in the rough, we can find these areas and use them as reference sites, knowing that this is what may have occurred elsewhere in this entire reach, and keeping a close eye out for these, again, these gems in the rough. Okay, continuing with the planning and design idea, let's talk just a little bit about construction plans and developing construction plans for your restoration project. When I say plans, I mean the ones that all the contractors are carrying around in their trucks and walking around in the field with. It's your design and all the details that go with it. Typically, we would contribute sheets to these packages for projects on the restoration earthwork and the revegetation details. And what I like to call thorough simplicity is really the target for my designs. I want my designs to be concise but informative. These plan sheets can't be too complicated or messy or difficult to decipher, because then a lot of the details get ignored or just cast aside. When we're putting together these plans, we're always thinking about constructability. And what I mean by that is, what does it take to actually implement the plan? And if you haven't done a lot of this kind of work and you haven't been around a lot of heavy equipment, I would suggest befriending a contractor who does, because you can't do an effective design for a restoration project without some level of understanding of what is possible for equipment and for people to actually do. There's lots of different kinds of equipment that you can use for these projects, but they all need their own subset of issues, have their own subset of issues with regard to access and maneuverability and capacity to move material and so on. And there's a lot of complicating factors with trucking, and it gets complicated. So if you don't have a comfort level with constructability, then try to connect with someone who has that experience. And then if we're providing complicated details on restoration features, say for example root wad installation, or maybe the construction of those soil lifts, I think having step-by-step details with photographs of other similar structures being constructed is really helpful. So let's talk a little bit about the construction plans. This is, sorry, I lost control again here. Try this one more time. There we go. So this is an example of a planting plan. This one came across my desk recently, and it basically exemplifies everything I don't like about planting plans. In fact, I'm getting a little dizzy just looking at it. It's impossible, not impossible, but it's difficult to decipher what's going on here. It's too busy. There's a lot on here. And one of the most important issues that I have with it is designating specific areas for planting woody plants. You can see these circles are to indicate shrub and tree placement. To me, this is a landscape architecture design. This is like urban planning. It's like building a park. You know, you want the oak tree next to the bench. This is not restoration to me. It's not the way I think we should approach these projects. Now, this is more like what my restoration plans look like. They look simple. This is actually the Delta project. We've got 3 zones of plant material. We've got green for emergent, orange for scrub shrub, and blue for riparian. And we can calculate our acreages of each zone so that we know what our estimated plant quantities are for each zone. But we're not designating exact planting areas. And this is accompanied by a cross section, and this is a typical cross section. It's just a cartoon. It's not a real on the ground cross section, but it shows the contractor, hey, we have 3 planting zones, A, B, C, and they correspond to these zones in this design, although this cross section is actually for a different project. And it shows, you know, we have a suite of plants that go in zone A, and they are situated between 0 and 1 foot above water. And then we have another suite of plants that go in zone B between 1 and 2 feet, and so on and so forth. And then it's very simple, straightforward, and then we combine that with a sheet like this that provides the details on the plant species and quantities needed for each zone, and then our seed mixes, and then some general notes, which we'll talk about more in a minute. If we zoom in a little bit on what's needed for these planting tables, it's just what you would expect. Here are our 3 zones. Here are the different species that we want in each zone, the quantities that need to be planted. And in addition to that, I'm also including information on our proposed density of planting. Again, this is a guideline. We're not designating, you know, we want you to put 1 plant on 3-foot centers everywhere like a grid. Sometimes we do that, but it's a guideline. So in this case, I'm saying groups of 5 plants on 4-foot centers. And then for zone B, you know, it's, you know, 4-foot centers and so on. Another thing I wanted to point out on this slide is that you might have noticed that I'm specifying both cuttings and containerized stock for this particular species. This is something I frequently do. We've been using cuttings for a long time, and these are, you know, we go harvest these from live plants and put them in the ground. They have their own purpose. It's nice when we need to get deep to try to access groundwater with those plants. But by far, it's my preference to bring containerized stock to the site that has existing root mass, so the plants don't have to struggle to develop roots for the first year or 2. We can put them in the ground and they can sort of hit the ground running. Okay, back to the construction notes idea. I try to get all important details regarding the restoration site construction into the notes. Now, some of these things come from specifications that might be a separate document, but I get everything onto the plan sheets because I don't want them to get lost in the shuffle. It's things like compost specifications, compost application rates, seeding application rates, what is our mulch approach and what is the application rate? How do we harvest the willows? Where are we getting them? How do we handle them once they're harvested? Are we, you know, what is our specification for loosening or decompacting? Do we have other regs that we want the contractor to be sure to comply with, such as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act? All of these things are important parts of our project, and if they're in the plans, they got a much better chance of being reviewed and read than they do if they're just in a specifications document. Okay, moving along here, a little bit on plant container sizing. This is a big deal for me. Most of my career, you know, we were sort of forced into the 1-gallon, 5-gallon options because that's all that the growers were providing. Now we're seeing a nice shift into deeper rooted stock, which is much more my preference for restoration. I feel like the 1 gallon, 5 gallon is a carryover from landscaping and really doesn't have a lot of application in restoration sites, as far as I can tell. I'd much rather come to a site with many more smaller, deeper rooted containers than fewer, bigger. So I put some approximate costs here to give you some perspective. If we're speccing a 5 gallon, say, cottonwood for $40 installed, I could get 3 or 4 of those cottonwoods in a 40 CI size. I got the same depth of root ball as the 5 gallon, and I'm getting much better distribution on my site, so I'm not putting all my eggs in one basket. So that's much more attractive to me with restoration than, you know, the fewer, bigger plants. Now, that maybe doesn't apply to some of your urban projects where, you know, you have requirements for larger tree stock. Here's another problem that I've seen a lot with the 1 gallon containers. It's only 6 inches deep to start with. And then, you know, if your nursery only puts 4 inches of fill in there to grow the plant in, you're talking about 4-inch deep root ball. And if you're trying to access groundwater, you're going to have much better luck with a 10-inch deep root ball that you get in a 40 CI for, you know, a fraction of the price. Okay, let's talk a little bit about seed mixes. This is a big one. I'm going to try to keep this brief, but this is a typical seed mix that I might use on a floodplain where we have some wetlands and we have some riparian areas. And you might notice that there's something missing. I have no sedges in here. I have nothing from the Cyperaceae family in these seed mixes. And that's mainly because most of those species require the seed to be stratified before it germinates. And it can be stratified naturally. If you're seeding in the fall, you might get good stratification over winter and you see good germination in the spring. But if you're seeding the site in spring, those seeds are likely just to sit there and get eaten by birds and small mammals or blow away before they germinate. And most of our projects, we have pretty aggressive re-veg standards for pretty short term. You know, within 5 years, we want pretty good cover. So most of my mixes, I then just focus on those plants that I think are going to germinate well and give us good cover, and then we'll supplement the seed with live plant material. And that's where we hit the sedges hard, is on the live plants. A couple other things I wanted to mention with regard to seed mixes is I think it's important for your plans to include any seed varieties if they exist. Basically, these are plants that are specially crafted to perform well in certain environments. And so if those are available to you, then you ought to be specifying them. And then seeds per square foot, this should show up on the plans as well, because if there are substitutions to be made, it's not as simple as like, oh, I have 2 pounds of glyceria and that's not available, but deschampsia is, so I'm going to add 2 pounds of deschampsia. Well, we need to know how many seeds per square foot because those vary greatly. And you can see my total seeds per square foot in this mix is pretty high at 160, but this is a hand broadcast rate, which is normally double your drill seeding rate. And we do have a lot of these, several of these species that have a lot of seeds per pound. I don't know if you've seen, many of you have seen Juncus seed, but it's basically like dust. And so a lot of those seeds actually don't make it into the site. They either blow away or they stay adhered to the sides of the bag and so on. But important to be considering seed size. Another thing that I do with my seed mixes, especially for those that are just wetland seed, is we end up with, wetland seed is typically mostly very small seeded species. So we end up with maybe only 7 or 8 pounds of seed for an entire acre. So that's really difficult to work with. And so I'll add rice hulls to all of my mixes to get them up to 25 pounds so that we have more material to work with. It also provides a visual indicator because the rice hulls are bright white, so you can see where you've seeded. Another thing I'd like to discuss with regard to seeding is the purity tests. This is really important, and I think a lot of people are not aware that you can request this information. So here's a purity test for Juncus balticus, and it basically tells me what else is in the seed. So here it tells me there are no noxious weeds, none found, which is great. But it also tells me, hey, there's some other crop in here. We've got 2,100 seeds per pound of tufted hairgrass. In this case, it's fine with me. That's something that would naturally occur, and we might be seeding anyway. So I would accept this lot of seed, this batch. Here's another example of Glyceria striata that we had for a project recently, and we got a big problem here. We've got 47,000 seeds per pound of something else, Poa trivialis, which is a non-native grass. It's fairly aggressive, and I don't want to be the responsible party for bringing this into a watershed that may or may not have Poa trivialis already. So if I hadn't requested these purity tests, I wouldn't know that my Glyceria seed had that, and we'd have a bit of a mess. We learned that we had Poa in our seed once we showed up to the site next year. If I didn't request this, I wouldn't know it. Okay, let's talk about some implementation tips. I wanted to start with some ideas or some thoughts on construction management. This is, it's a little cut off here, but is construction management a Sisyphean task? And I don't know if everyone's familiar with Sisyphus, but he's the guy who has to roll the boulder up the hill for eternity, and it keeps rolling back down on him. So I sometimes feel like Sisyphus when I'm doing construction management. Basically, construction management is being out with the contractors, helping them decipher your plans and build your restoration site. And oftentimes we get to work with contractors that we've never worked with before, that maybe have never built wetlands before. And so I find myself being very repetitive with these projects, saying the same things to all the different contractors. So it sometimes feels like a futile task, which is what Sisyphus is experiencing. So just a few tips on construction management. If your client has hired you to be out there during construction, you are the only advocate for the resource. You can assume that and take on that role. Whatever you have to say about it is going to make a difference. It's important to be friendly with the team, but stern. If there's something you need to get done, you can get it done, but there's no need to be angry or antagonistic about it. The plans and specs that the contractor is using to build your restoration site, the plans and specs that you developed are the contract for them. So it's what they base their bid on, and there should be no surprises for the contractor when you ask him or her to follow the design and the specifications. I think it's important that you do your best to adhere to the plans and specs that you developed, unless there are field conditions that dictate otherwise. If you do need to field fit something, I think it's important to choose your collaborators at that point wisely. Some people on the project team may have ulterior motives or other interests, usually around money. So if you want to collaborate with the team, just make sure you're taking their input with a grain of salt, and be sure not to be pressured into a decision or a compromise that you're uncomfortable with. If you need to stop work and make the excavators and the haul trucks all sit idle for half an hour while you figure out what you want to do that, because at the end of the day, you're the only advocate for the resource, and you need to make the best decision you can make. As the construction manager, you need to be careful dictating means and methods. And what's meant by that is you've given the design, but you can't tell the contractor how to implement it, how to get it done. All you can do is say, hey, this is what I want at the end of the day, and then the contractor gets to decide how he gets there. That's the way a lot of the contractors make a lot of money. A lot of these people are really good at what they do. They're really good at coming up with innovative, unique approaches to solving problems. So you may think you know the best means and methods, but chances are you probably don't, and somebody has a great idea that will get you there. So at the end of the day, have patience. You are making a difference, and construction management may only just seem like a Sisyphean task. Okay, sticking with implementation, let's talk about loosening. If there's one thing that I'd say is the most important part of restoration, it's not leaving these sites compacted. you must loosen these sites before planting, after all the construction's done, especially if these areas have been used as haul roads or other used by other equipment. We want this kind of loose, friable environment. We get more potential for habitat diversity. We get areas for water to collect, for seed to get nestled into the soil surface. We get some wind protection. We get potentially some shade. It's just really good for all things restoration. So we want something that looks like this, not like this. And not like this. There's a little video for you. This was a site that the contractor said was ready for planting, and I literally laughed out loud and said, "Hey, would you want to plant your garden in a site like this?" I like to use the garden analogy because many people have gardens. You certainly wouldn't plant your garden in something that looked like that. So we want our sites to look like this, and like this upper picture. This is a picture I just took this week. Lower picture is the same site as the upper, but it was before our loosening and compost incorporation. Okay, moving along here with some more tips. Transplants. This is another really easy, cheap, amazing technique for getting instant vegetation. I would expect most of you are doing this already, but you can use an excavator to harvest willows or sod mats and replace those in your sites. Here's the Peanut Reach project. We had an excavator for a day. It cost less than a couple $1,000s, and we transplanted, 40 or 50 whole willows. So really nice, easy way to get good veg cover. This was just this week on a project where we were transplanting wetland sod, moving it down to new channel location. Instant veg, instant bank line. Here's another video for you. This is again on a Peanut Reach. We were able to harvest again great existing sod and willows, and in this case we were actually using it to form the bank line like I mentioned earlier in the aerial photo. So we're moving this from some existing wetlands to our new wetlands so that we can have instant bank protection. Okay, nursery and plant inspections. So before any of my projects get planted, I make sure I inspect the plant material. I either go to the nursery to do that and inspect it on site, or I inspect it when it's delivered to the project. What we're looking for here is nice, tight root balls that have nice, healthy, vibrant roots. Above ground mass is fine. I'm not that interested in that. Sometimes we do want a lot of above ground mass because we want a deep plant or something, but generally I'm much more interested in the below ground mass. Some typical problems we see, here's an example of maybe where the irrigation didn't quite get these plants, so we have some dead stock. The photos on the right, this is the job I did with friend and colleague Scott Jecker down in Oklahoma. We're taking the delivery in March, and we were having a difficult time determining whether these plants were dormant or dead. And we did end up determining that some of them were dead, but really tiny shoots here. So another problem is, here on the right is a 5-gallon shrub that was a 1-gallon the week before. So they're selling it to us as a 5-gallon, charging us the 5-gallon price, but giving us a 1-gallon plant. Other problems, this is typical of a plant that's just not ready for market. The root ball just falls apart. And here's a couple other, not a great picture on the left, but this is alder with blister, which we don't really want to be importing to our site if we can help it. And then here's some roses with mold. So it's important to inspect all the plant material so you make sure you're getting as much healthy stock delivered as possible. Okay, monitoring tips. We're kind of getting near the end here. There's all kinds of different monitoring to be done. We're really, for today, I'm just going to talk a little bit about vegetation monitoring, but generally monitoring is a way for us to measure the response of the site to the restoration, and then we use performance standards to measure success of that response. So a few tips on performance standards. Basically, as I said earlier, the performance standards are synonymous with our goals and our desired condition. They should be measurable and verifiable and be practical. They need to reflect the monitoring period. If you know ahead of time you're only going to be able to monitor for a year, or if you're going to monitor for 5 years or 20 years, then you can craft your performance standards accordingly so that you can get some meaningful results within your monitoring period. They also should reflect your ability. If you're not a great botanist, don't have performance standards that require you to key everything to species. You can do cover by growth form, or you can do other things like measure slope stability, or use other techniques that don't require botany. And then it's really important to craft the language of the performance standards carefully. The standards should be flexible enough to foster unforeseen benefits, so you can take advantage of good things that happen on your site. And some examples are, if you use language like X% cover, that's great, versus X% survivability. If you say something about survivability, then you really need to compare what's on the ground during your monitoring to what you installed. And so you're doing some math and you're having to count plants, which is problematic. Saying something like list B noxious weeds versus state listed, like here in Colorado, we have list A, list B, list C, and watch list. So if you just said state listed species had to be less than 5%, you'd be monitoring all of those, and maybe all you care about are list A and B. Another example would be saying that this site has appropriate wetland hydrology. That gives you some flexibility. But if you say something like 10 consecutive days of saturation within 12 inches, you're kind of dialed to, you're kind of sucked into monitoring daily during the growing season. Performance standards can be defined through different ways. As I said earlier, you can define these through assessment, your pre-construction assessment, like we talked about, through reference sites. And they may be dictated by regulations, or you may be able to base your standards on research. So here quickly are a couple examples of, this is the river restoration in Meeker, where we set our standards based on our assessment. We know we want to get our water, our hydrology variables up, so we're basing our standards on that. Here's an example where it's based on the regulations. So this was handed down to us. There's really nothing we can say about it. We have to get this many acres, this much percent cover of good veg, and this much percent cover of, maximum cover of bad veg. Here's an example. This is, I got cut off a little bit. My colleague Peter Gell from Australia, he's a paleoecologist looking at the microbial record. It's pretty interesting. This is a site that 1,000 years ago did not contain any cattail, and 500 years ago, cattail was dominant. So if you want to use research to define your performance standards, you can, but then you run into this conundrum of how far back you want to restore to, which obviously ties back to our reference site discussion. Okay, and then some important considerations on the veg monitoring. Your methods need to match your performance standards, and you need to choose a method that's appropriate for your site. Timing of data collection is key. Being there at the same time every year. I visit all my sites in either August or September, kind of the peak of the growing season. Here's a couple examples on how I determine my monitoring approach. This is the Delta project. What I did in order to figure out where I'm going to collect data and where I'm going to set up my transects was I measure the length of the site, say it's 1,000 feet long, and then I use a random number generator to determine where my transects are going to go on that line. And then I oriented them to magnetic north. And then we collect data on each one of these transects. Here's another approach that I use, is where I'll set up a grid. I think these are 50-foot squares. And then I'll use a random number generator. And let's say I land on 341. That's a start point for one of my transects. Another approach, this was a reservoir job where we were really interested in what's going on the elevation gradient. So we set up a bunch of these little short transects to revisit. One last thing on monitoring is I'm really a stickler on photo documentation and lining up the horizon. This is another project in Crested Butte, but it just shows how easy it is to to see results with photos if you've got your photographs lined up properly. You can see the horizons match perfectly here. Okay, I think this is the last little bit of monitoring tips. The function-based approach, again, going back to this Meeker River Restoration Project, we're using FACWET, our functional assessment for Colorado wetlands, as a tool to help us assess whether our restoration was a success or not. Do we show improvement in the hydrology variables? It was really easy. I set up this data sheet. Basically, here are our impaired variables. These are the reasons for our impairment. Basically, in this case, we're not seeing overbank flows because of the levees and the weirs. We proposed our remedy as part of our restoration. That is the restoration, to remove the levees and restore the overbank flows. And then we can just simply go to the field with a checklist and say, do we see these things on the ground? Have we been successful at restoring surface flows? Pretty easy. Any monkey could go do this and be like, oh, wow, yeah, we do have drift deposits. We do have evidence of flow. We do see a healthy and diverse vegetation community developing. We do see volunteer hydrophytes. So it's a really easy way to get a functions-based approach of success rather than spending days monitoring vegetation cover, to determine cover. We can come out and very quickly determine if we met our goals. Okay, this is the last slide. I didn't want to leave this presentation without briefly talking about some ideas for improving restoration. These are really big topics, and I would love to have more dialogue about any of these. As you all know, probably we're having our meeting, our annual SWS meeting in Denver in 2018. So I would love to connect with any of you here to talk about these things. One idea that I have, it's not that unique, is to create a database of professionals. And then people that sign up to be part of the database could search for experts by region or by expertise. And I think we could use the wetland restoration section as a starting point for this. So we have a form that for all of us as professionals fill out in terms of what we think our expertise is and where we work and what we like to work with and what we're good at. And then others can search by keywords to find us. This just came up this week. A friend of mine called and was asking for a wetland restoration professional in Kansas City. So I could easily go to this database and find someone that has met a certain, certain level of screening. Another thing, this is for all the researchers out there and academicians, is I would love it if we could get you guys to publish research briefs on your work. A lot of us in the private sector don't have access to journals, don't have access to the scientific community at large. So if we could come up with a way to, even if it's just publishing abstracts of your papers so that, we have one place where we could go to try to find out about topics and we could search on keywords. That would be great, because I really, again, want to get more information from the academicians, and I'd love for the academicians to get more information from the practitioners to maybe inform the research that is being done. Another idea is to provide these apprenticeships. I can envision connecting seasoned practitioners to universities and academicians for guest lecturing and mentoring of students. I'm kind of involved in this now. I do have an intern or an apprentice working with me now, and it's been great. And I think it's a goal for me to get more engaged in local universities in this role. But I think it could be a way to get the researchers and the practitioners working together inherently by doing this. And then lastly, this is another idea I rolled out a couple of years ago in a presentation at SWS, was the idea of putting together a restoration council. So it's like pre-qualified restoration professionals that it's a group of people, and it's very analogous to like reviewing journal articles. Basically, it's a group of people that have an expertise, and we then partner with regulating agencies to help them review restoration plans, mitigation plans. We review and provide comments on whether those plans are acceptable as is, or acceptable with major revisions, or need to be rejected. And that would help our regulating folks, regulating agencies and personnel have some technical support. Okay, I think that is it. Thank you for all your time, and I look forward to having more dialogue with everybody in Denver at the end of May.
Thank you, Andy. We have quite a few questions, so we have a few minutes remaining here, but we can go a little bit over for those who want to stay to hear the questions. We have about 5 minutes of our scheduled time. So I want to go ahead and start off with the questions from when I first received them. So for the Meeker project, it sounds like you're describing natural channel evolution, morphing from a deep and narrow to a wide and shallow multi-channel system. So what was the impetus for restoring, in quotation marks, this back to a single channel stream?
Yeah, good question. So in that case, it actually wasn't a natural evolution. It was caused by the installation of those weirs. And so the river was just going around those weirs that were installed in the stream, and it isn't naturally a multi-thread system. So we removed all the weirs and restored it back to its more natural condition.
Good. Okay, something a little bit about the plantings. How do you handle wildlife herbivory on the live plantings by geese and beaver, elk and deer and moose and things like that? You talked about the seeds being eaten, but what about those plantings?
Yeah, so that's another great one. Basically, we try to share. Most of our projects have enough plantings that we can't possibly provide wholesale protection of those plants because we just have thousands and thousands of them. And so that would, the cost of protection would be way beyond the cost of the plants themselves. And so we hope for the best. If we have a reason to believe that there is a really high density or really high risk, we will do some fencing. But most of the time we just expect some losses, which is another benefit of doing the smaller, more numerous plantings, is if you lose a few to herbivory or browsing, it's not a disaster.
And another one that's related to the containerized plants, it says, how easily obtainable are the CI plants? I think specifically what I call tubelings, the ones that are the very deep, thin tubes, not the 1 or 5 gallons, the CI plants.
Yeah, so at least in the Rocky Mountain region, we've kind of shifted the paradigm a little bit, so those are pretty widely available here. If you're working in another part of the country or the world, drop me an email, and what I would suggest is connecting with your local nurseries and suggesting these containers. And then if you need more information on where to get them, or if they do, they could contact me and I can get you that information. But we're getting all of ours from a manufacturer on the West Coast, Pacific Northwest. And I think a lot of these came from forestry, these sizes. So they're out there. It's just a matter of getting the nurseries to sign on to grow them. So maybe some big contract grows for those nurseries would be enough to warrant them bringing them in. And I would add that the 40 cubic inch and the 60 cubic inch are the two that I like to use the most because they share the same tray. So we can get 2 different sizes without having to double the infrastructure, or the cost for the trays themselves to carry these things around.
Right. I have a lot on the planting and the seeds. Another one is any ideas on sourcing seeds that are less commonly used in replanting? They want to see a diverse community, but their planting palette has 20 species in it, and several of them are hard to find by a supplier, let alone germination and seeds per pound details, so they probably don't even have the ability to do those seed tests. They expect they won't get all of them, but they'd like to get as many as possible. So you have any way of, like you said, you've changed the paradigm a little bit on the cubic inch containerized seedlings. Is there any changes to the seed sources that you can get there locally or even in other places?
Yeah, this has been a problem for a long time. So crafting a seed mix is an art because you have to kind of have an understanding of what's commercially available. And if the client is asking for something that's not commercially available, then in many cases, I kick it back to the client to say, well, then you need to help us come up with those sources. So fund the collection of those plants if we have sources nearby, or work with another seed vendor to basically contract collect those. But that doesn't always work because a lot of these species don't set viable seed every year. So I think the owners of these projects, the clients, need to be flexible in what they're requiring of the designers and have realistic expectations of what's possible. So I think what I do see happen a lot is a contractor has their preferred seed vendor, and that seed vendor has his sources or her sources, and that's it. They might check their source and say, oh no, it's not available. And if I push a little harder, sometimes I get them to call around to, instead of 2 or 3 vendors, like 6 or 7, and maybe we can find those things. But this is a problem that's not going away because it's ecology, it's nature, and these plants don't always set viable seeds, so it's not always going to be available.
I have just 2 more on the seeds and their sources. About the purity test is one of them. When you request a purity test for your seed mixes, is it test done by the distributor, and do you trust the results when you get it from the distributor?
Yeah, so far so good. I think what they're doing for these tests is someone sitting in a lab looking at seed shapes, and they know what the seeds are by their shapes, and so that's why sometimes they don't have it identified down to the species, because they might just know, you know, it's a bluegrass. But I do, at this point, I have been trusting the results because it is certified and should be, as much as I trust pretty much anything in this world.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Maybe you get second opinions or something.
Yeah.
So I just want to kind of change into a little bit about morphology and hydrology a little bit here. How do you plan vegetative establishment in a floodplain that's of a flashy river, something that has really large amplitude? And do you have to replace losses due to flooding very often?
Yeah, so this has come up before. We've had sites where we wanted to replace wetlands on floodplains, and we ended up not doing it because it was for Clean Water Act compliance. And so the project team was concerned if the site didn't stick around, we would never meet our performance standards, and you know, it would be the eternal cycle of constantly replacing. So I think if you're working, you know, 3 of the 4 projects that I presented today were voluntary projects. So in that case, we have more flexibility. If it is a regulatory compliance project, it's probably advisable to try to stay off the channel edge in these really flashy systems if you can. There are other things you could do. The deep-rooted stock helps. Cuttings help. Like if you can get some cuttings in deep, even in a flashy system, they'll stick around. The stubbier, shorter plant material tends to get washed out more easily, so the deeper rooted stock helps there. There is wetland sod that you can purchase or again transplant, and you could stake that sod into place. But sometimes it is just the nature of the beast, and you know, we have to be flexible. These are floodplain environments; they're dynamic, and we have to manage our clients' expectations on what's possible on these projects.
Right. Well, and you talked about performance standards. So, if you, what performance standards do you have to protect against? What they, you know, where you have these quote unquote normal losses? So, like you have a 2-year return interval on floods or something like that. How can you? I noticed you were taking some of those performance standards and making them easier to achieve, where you're not kind of boxing yourself into a certain number of days of flooding and that type of thing. So how can you kind of protect yourself in some of those ways?
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't get to write the performance standards, right? But sometimes you get to, if it's a voluntary project, you have standards with the client that you're going to say these are our successful performance measures of success.
Yeah. If if we have the flexibility to write the standards, then we might write something more about a heterogeneous kind of environment where it's dynamic, and as long as the site as a whole kind of meets some standards, that we don't want to get too detailed. It's all about scale. If we look at a very small parcel within the site, it might not meet our standards, but if we look at it as a whole, it is, because we've preserved the floodplain, we've preserved the habitat diversity, and we're seeing it function like it should. Like my example on the Poudre River, where it's flooding and scouring and depositing every year, and so things are constantly changing. That in and of itself could be a performance standard.
Right.
For the times when
building in the uncertainty is, I think, really important.
Yes, right. And then again, managing expectations of like, well, you know what, this might not be a 3 or 5 year monitoring period. This may be a 10-year monitoring period, and we'll see this stuff work itself out over the longer term. And so crafting a monitoring approach that's cost effective and efficient so that it doesn't cost the client a ton of money every year, then maybe dragging it out to 10 years is not that big a deal.
Right. I have 2 more questions. We're just a few minutes over. One of them is about topographic surveys. Do you do the topographic surveys on the site and develop existing and proposed contours on design plans, or do you contract that out?
It happens many different ways, both of those ways, and sometimes we don't actually do a detailed topo. We'll just, again, do these cartoons of cross sections and say, we have our groundwater data, say we monitored our site pre-construction. We know we need to excavate to about 3 feet, and we just leave it at that, and we estimate approximate quantities. And then during planting, we may use laser level to identify the zones exactly on the ground, or we can almost do that visually in most cases. But in certain cases, it's complicated enough, we'll use a laser level. And then we, again, have a little flexibility in our zones. If we said, based on our concept, we needed 1,000 zone A plants and 2,000 zone B plants, and our as-built is slightly different, then we just modify our densities a little bit to absorb those plants that may be extra if our numbers were a little off. So as I say to my team, pretty much everything we do is the ish factor, because and we can call ourselves ecological engineers. I never do, but I like to think of everything as ish.
Right. Well, and I have one last one about your way that you're doing your monitoring afterwards. I do want to make a comment that you talked about, using photography where you have this horizon line, and you had a great, horizon with mountains. A little bit more difficult in Florida, just saying. We don't have any mountains in the horizon line. We have to use a cabbage palm or 2 or something like that. There was somebody wanted you to explain that grid sampling random number method. Do you think you can get back to that
Yeah, sure.
slide? Do you want me to do that? And after that, I'll end up with our announcement of our next webinars.
Yeah, sure. So this is, it looks more complicated than it is. Basically what I did is have my GIS professional lay out a grid. In this case, again, I picked a 50-foot square. So our entire site gets covered by the grids, and any of the 50 by 50s that aren't completely within the site get dismissed. So for example, if my random number came out to be 312, I would throw it out because it's on the edge and it's not wholly within the site. And this site's a little more complicated because we have different habitat types. So I would do random number generator for each habitat type. So the bright green here, we then randomly select a number, say it's 340. That becomes the start point of a transect, and I usually will predetermine the length of those transects of what I want. In this case, I think these were 100-meter transects. Or no, these were 100 feet. No, these were 100 meter. And so that would be the start point for a 100-meter transect. And then I usually would either predetermine the bearing of that transect, or I would choose it based on how I could fit it in to this habitat type.
Right. And for those that are listening, you can do these random point generators. You can get them out of a book, but you can just type it in on Google, and you just say, I need a random number, and it'll just give you a series of random numbers to select the cells.
Yeah, and I can't tell you how the GIS works, but I have a great GIS person, and he just gives me these quickly.
He does the magic, right?
That's right.
Okay, well, I want to go ahead and let me get back control here on the screen. We can go out to the bottom slides here. And first of all, I want to thank you, Andy, for giving this presentation, taking time out of your day to share all these tips. I think some of these really practical tips are things that a lot of us take for granted, that sure, everybody knows that, and so I really appreciate that. And I also am really intrigued by your idea of kind of getting the academics and the research-oriented folks in, linked in with the people that are on the ground doing this, because the academics also need to have what really works and what doesn't, not just some of the things that they've seen in their research from the practitioners. So I think it's a really good partnership. So thank you for doing that today, Andy. I want to remind everybody our next webinar is going to be our SWS Legacy webinar, and that will be presented by Dr. Paul Ketty, and that will be on December 14th. And also, if you have any ideas when you get the poll after the evaluation survey after this webinar, please give us ideas, or if you would like to be a speaker, let us know on those evaluation surveys. And finally, like Andy said, we're really excited about our meeting coming up in Denver. He is the chair of the planning committee for the Denver meeting. And so it's never too early to make sure you save the date for that. And also, one last thing, if you love our webinar series, we would like some extra help on the webinar committee. There's several folks, since we've been doing this a little over 2 years now, that are going to be rotating off the committee. So you really don't need to have any prior experience. I'm not a techno person, so me leading this is just right there, shows you don't have to have any technology experience. Just have a phone, a computer, and a willingness to serve. And you can contact the SWS office, put it on your evaluation survey, or you can email me. Andy, did you provide your email address?
I think it was on that last slide, but it might have gotten cut off.
Here, let me see if it's up here.
Oh yeah, there
okay. It is. And if Andy, if you have any other questions for Andy, or you want to send Andy a little thank you note, you can go ahead and email him at andy@alpine-eco.com. And again, I want to thank everybody for attending today, and especially Andy for making the presentation. So I hope to see everyone or hear everyone at the December webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim.
Thanks, Andy.